Hello, everybody, and welcome to our DSDN parent webinar series here tonight. We are in, I think tonight is our fourth session that we started here this season. Our goal is to really set the stage for parents as you're going through these initial days and months and first parts of your journey, and hopefully setting a nice foundation for some information that could become really helpful in the future. And so that way you're not struggling at the moment when you really need it and you've had some of this information kind of front loaded. So that's our goal. I'm Jen Jacob, Executive Director for DSDN and co-founder, and have been hosting these meetings. It's been great to see so many people. We know we generally have some people joining us online. We know a lot of people will be accessing this later on. So just so you're aware, it will be available in our DSDN online parent library. So we'll send that link to you once we have everything ready to go. It will be, our aim is to have everything ready by the end of May. So once you get those links, you'll have access to reading and listening and talking about some of these things. And we're looking at just some other ways that we can do some conversations around these topics as well. So stay tuned for that. If you're on tonight, it means you have the link because you signed up and registered. So we have your email and we'll make sure that we get that information to you. I will do a little piece at the end as well to remind everybody, but let's see, this week is April, next week is May 5th is our next session. Oh, Cinco de Mayo, just occurring to me. We will have one of the team members from NDSS, and as a reminder, that's National Down Syndrome Society, and they'll be discussing the differences between IFSPs and IEPs. So some things that you come up with parenting that you might be working with your school district or other early interventions. So that will be another really good one if you're interested in kind of doing some front loading for that. So that will happen next Thursday night. We are so excited tonight to have Dr. Stein with us. He's probably sick of us emailing him at this point, but we just know how important this conversation has been. I know a lot of us have the book. At the retreats every year, Dr. Stein, people come and do like a little book study together and talk about the book and talk about what they're doing. For us, it was a real game changer. We've already talked about it on a couple of these the webinar sessions as well. So I'm excited for people to hear about what your basics of the book are and just to have some kind of just general knowledge around your concepts here. So I'm going to let you take it away and I'm going to zip it. If you have questions here tonight, guys, you can go ahead and type them in the chat and then we'll do some Q&A at the end. The questions and answers will be more around like topics and broad questions versus specifics about your kiddo's behavior. So just keep that in mind and pop anything into the chat as our discussion is going tonight. I'll let you take it away.
Thank you, Jen, for having me, and thank you all for listening. It's always a pleasure to be invited back, even remotely. And, it's kind of nice that we're able to do these meetings more easily nowadays. I guess one of the silver linings of all the madness of the last couple of years. So tonight we're talking about behavior. And whenever I do this, it's usually, a pretty popular topic. I think I do an okay job talking about this, but I think that's more a reflection of just how common this issue is. So tonight, the goal is really to help you understand why behaviors are occurring and then give you some basic tools and strategies that you can kind of build on by understanding why those are the strategies that tend to work. And then you can adapt those strategies for your own household and your own situation. So to start, I wanted to think about, what life is really about and what makes people happy. And this is something that's been investigated with research. In one study is called the Harvard Adult Development Study. This study looked at two groups of people, so wealthier people from Harvard University, and then people from less socioeconomically advantaged area of Greater Boston, and they compared how those people's lives went over time, over decades. And they looked at what led to happiness. And what they found is that being healthy certainly mattered, but they found that wealth and education weren't as important. And what they found, the big finding of that study, was that they learned that relationships were really the most important thing. That's what tended to make people happy. So if you want to think about, from my perspective as a psychologist, what's life about? Well, it's about relationships. And relationships are what tend to make people happy. So when we're thinking about behavior, relationships is really kind of the backdrop for that, and how to manage behaviors. And I think this has especially been true over the last couple of years, where we've all been more isolated than we would like and had less support than we would like. It really kind of highlights how we really need to be focused on building and maintaining the most positive relationships we can with our kids. Jen always says really nice things about me. I would also like to take a moment and just kind of take myself down a couple of pegs, take you back to the year 2002. And at that time, I was working at what was called a child behavior specialist. And what that really means is that I was someone that didn't really know anything about kids or anything about behavior. I had a degree in psychology and child development, so I certainly thought I knew what I was doing. But it turned out when I was working with the kids, I actually was really bad at this. And my point in telling you that is not to say that, Jen and DSDN invited the wrong person to speak to you, but rather to say that this is hard work. And when we're working on behavior, the goal is not 100% success. It's not as if you're going to listen to my talk tonight and tomorrow everything is going to be 100% fine all the time. That's just not reality. The goal is for improvement. We want over time things to get a little better, a little easier. And just like this graph that you see, which is taken from the stock market, there's going to be ups and downs along the way. You're going to have good days and bad days. But over time, we want behavior to improve as you learn strategies and your child develops. If we think about this as a long and bumpy road, then it also kind of highlights that we have to take care of ourselves along the way. So taking care of yourself also means taking care of your adult relationships. So a lot of times when I meet with parents, one of the first things that I say is, you need to take a break. You need to take a break from dealing with this. You need to take a break from thinking about this. Sometimes when parents are struggling with something developmentally or behaviorally with their child, it's all they think about. And I think that can be really detrimental and it can make the problem worse. So a lot of times what I tell people is go out on a date, go take a walk, hang out with a friend, watch some sports, do something that's not dealing with this for tonight. So here we have Popeye and Olive Oil on their first date. And Olive Oil is really concerned that she has spinach in her teeth, but of course, Popeye is happy that she does. So breaks are really important because we have to take care of ourselves. This is not a quick and easy fix. The next thing I'd like to share with you is the epidemiology of behavior problems in Down syndrome. And epidemiology just really means how common is this? How often does this happen? So the best answer to that, in my opinion, is from some studies that show that there are about 30% of kids with Down syndrome who have behavior problems that are disruptive enough that someone like me would have a name for them, would have a diagnosis for them, like ADHD or an impulse control disorder or a disruptive behavior disorder. There are all these different names for it, but it basically means that your behavior is really interfering in your life and that of your family. In contrast, only about 10% of typically developing children have a behavior condition. So that means by having that extra chromosome, you have about 3 times the risk for developing behavior problems. Unfortunately, even more kids with Down syndrome have behavior problems that can still cause problems and still might cause you stress, even if I wouldn't have a name for it. And I might just say, this is pretty typical 5-year-old behavior in Down syndrome, as you're, getting used to kindergarten or that kind of thing, or as a teenager. So I wouldn't say it's a clinical problem, but it still might be hard for you to deal with. So these things are really common. Unfortunately, if you are a child with a disability, a developmental disability, a DD, who has behavior problems, you're more likely to be an adult with a developmental disability who has behavior problems. So in other words, behavior problems in kids tend to be predictive of behavior problems in adults. And even more concerning than that is that we spend so much time during childhood working with kids on their academics and their speech and their motor skills and their daily living skills and their job skills, because that's the thing that correlates most with outcomes in adulthood. So we put in tons of effort to teach kids what they need to have a good adult life. But unfortunately, behavior problems can kind of wash out all of that good stuff. All that good work that we did can be wiped out by behavior issues. And the reason for that is that if you spend your whole life working on all your skills so that you can go get a job and live in a community where you want to live, but then you go to that job or you go to that house with your friends that you're going to live, and you're aggressive, or you take people's things, or you destroy their property, people aren't going to want to work with you and people aren't going to want to live with you. So behavior issues can kind of limit what people can do. My point is not to say that if you have behavior problems or your child has behavior problems right now, that they're always going to have behavior problems and that it's going to ruin everything that you're working for. My point is to say, when you see behavior problems, we really need to deal with them. We need to intervene so that we can help people do their best and get where they want to go. The next question is of etiology, or why. Why does this happen? Why do we see more behavior problems in Down syndrome? So obviously, doing what I do for a living, I go back to the brain. There are some key brain differences. This is research that was done by Lynn Nadel and Deb Fidler, who did a lot of the really amazing neuroscience studies of Down syndrome. And they found some key differences. So they found in the front of the brain, the red area, the frontal lobe, that there was reduced growth, so less size, less growth. And then in the rear, they found smaller brainstem and cerebellum, that brown and light blue area. And then in the middle, they found some challenges in the memory centers of the brain, the temporal lobe and the hippocampus, that yellow region. So they found lots of different structural differences after kids reached toddlerhood. But what does that actually mean functionally, right? Because it's great to know what these brain regions are called and what the differences are, but it's really more helpful to understand what that's going to lead to behaviorally. So what the consequences of those differences in the brain are, number one, that there are some social differences. So people with Down syndrome tend to be more aware of other people and more engaged with other people. So this can be a really amazing thing. You know, babies with Down syndrome are more aware of other people in their environment than kids who don't have Down syndrome. It's kind of like a superpower. It's really a cool, amazing thing. But it can also be problematic or challenging at times, because if you're hyper aware of other people, you can also be really sensitive to them, right? So what we see is that when people with Down syndrome are so engaged with others, they read others' emotions at a very high level. So they might be picking up on signals that you're sending. Let's say if you're frustrated with a behavior, or you're doing, trying to do some discipline or something like that, you might be sending a lot of signals even without knowing it. So people with Down syndrome have what I like to call a very strong social and emotional radar. They can really read other people very well a lot of times. And again, that can be a great thing, but it can also be a challenge if you're a frustrated, tired parent that's trying to get out the door to work, right? So you can lead to a lot of inadvertent issues in your behavior management strategies. These studies also have shown what we call aggressive social problem solving, which is just a fancy word for hitting, right? So it's basically saying that, when you run into an issue with another person, sometimes it's hard for people with Down syndrome to communicate clearly or to think about the consequences of their behavior and to plan ahead. And as a result of that, people might just resort to hitting and aggression to try and figure out how to get the ball back or to get what they need in a situation, which can obviously cause a lot of issues. So there's some key social differences. The next difference is in language. People with Down syndrome tend to understand a lot more than they can express. So their receptive language is stronger than their expressive language. And specifically, people with Down syndrome tend to have trouble articulating sounds, so making the speech sounds that someone else can understand, and then also formulating their ideas, so kind of organizing their thoughts for someone else to understand what they're trying to say. And you can imagine, if you're very socially aware and engaged with other people, and you understand a lot of what's being said, but you can't say your piece and you can't share what you think, it can be really, really frustrating. So a lot of behavior issues that we see, especially in younger kids with Down syndrome, are rooted in problems with language and communication. We have just a few more brain differences. The next one is in information processing and memory. So generally speaking, people with Down syndrome have stronger visual processing of information rather than verbal. So pictures, videos tend to work much, much better than speaking. And this is why it's great that a lot of classrooms nowadays have visual schedules all over and icons to map everything out for kids. That didn't used to be the case, but we've really come a long way. And then we also see that there are problems with what we call encoding and consolidation, which means taking in new information and transferring it from your short-term memory to your long-term memory and storing it there. So, for example, your teacher is giving you a direction and you might not get it the first time, right? You might not totally understand and process and retain that. So you might need the teacher to say it a few times. This is really tough because, we live in a busy world. A lot of times people aren't so aware that they need to repeat something or they need to give you a visual. They need to give you some help with this. So as a person with Down syndrome that's not maybe processing everything that's being said, it can be really stressful and scary. I don't know what you want me to do, right? I know that you're frustrated. I can read your emotions really well, but I'm not really sure what I'm supposed to be doing right now. That can make the world seem kind of unpredictable and scary. And when the world feels unpredictable and scary, people get anxious. And when people get anxious, they get resistant and they don't want to do what you want them to do. And they might flop to the floor or say no or scream and yell, right? So we see a lot of those behaviors when kids are not understanding what we need them to do. The next one is motivation differences. So some of these studies have shown problems with what we call intrinsic motivation. So that kind of internal get up and go to complete a task, to get it done correctly and completely. So the studies are well done, and I don't, fault them for finding this difference in the brain. I just have a little bit of a different way of thinking about it, which is that I think if you have a disability, everything's just a little harder, right? It's a little harder to get through the school day. It's a little harder to get your work done. It's a little harder to socialize, a little harder to get through a meal, whatever it may be. And over time, that's frustrating, right? You're just running out of gas. So I think of it as the gas in the tank theory, in that if you have two people who wake up in the morning with a full tank of gas, but one person has a disability and the other person does not, the person with the disability their tank is being depleted more quickly than the other person because things are just taking more effort and more energy. The other example would be if you have two people walking down the street from point A to point B, and person A has two healthy legs, and person B has a broken leg and is in a cast with crutches. Even though they walk the same distance, the person with the crutches is going to be more tired because it's harder, right? So similarly, we see that in people with disabilities, that they just get more tired, plain and simple. And that, I think, can lead to motivation differences and refusal to do things, especially things that are hard. And then finally, we have differences in what we call executive functions. Executive functions are all those skills in our brain that we need in order to accomplish a goal. So we need to plan, we need to organize, we need to pay attention, but we also need to control our impulses, right? So let's say, the ball is rolling across the street. I need to look both ways, ask an adult, not just go get that ball, right? Sometimes people with Down syndrome have a lot of trouble with that, about thinking about what's going to happen if I do this behavior. And how do I plan and consider a better choice, right? So that can obviously cause lots of behavior issues. And that goes back to that social problem solving, the aggressive social problem solving, rather, where you may resort to hitting because you may not be thinking about what's going to happen if I, use my body to solve this problem rather than my words. So if you think about all of these brain differences, you can imagine, if you think about the world that we live in, it's kind of a perfect storm, right? If we don't support kids with Down syndrome and give them what they need, it's no surprise that they act out and that we see a lot of behavior issues. So now that you understand why these behaviors are coming up, what can we do about them? I think that's why most of you are here tonight. So we're going to go through a few different ideas. The first one is relationships, like we talked about before. In the early days of studying the mind and behavior, people thought that, the reason people have relationships is to survive, right? It's to meet their basic needs. That was called drive theory. But in the 50s, some psychologists came along and said, that seems too simple. And they did some studies where they put monkeys in cages with a monkey on the left, or a pretend monkey, that would meet their basic needs. So this robotic looking figure would provide food and water. And then they had a terry cloth monkey, a monkey that was wrapped in fur but didn't do anything. It didn't provide them with anything. So if you only formed a bond with something because it helps you survive, then the monkeys would form a bond with this mother, the wire one that provided the food and water. But the opposite happened. The monkeys bonded with the furry mother that looked more like a monkey. So this was the start of people saying, you know what, there's a lot more to relationships than just meeting your basic needs. And this is what we call attachment theory, or I think it's more accurate to call it attachment science now because it's really well established. And what we know is basically that relationships are really important and they go both ways. So when we have positive relationships, kids function better, they're healthier, they're happier, they handle stress better, they're more resilient. But it's not just kids, it's also the adults. We're happier and healthier too. Our bodies are healthier, we have better mental health, we have better stress management, we have less stress hormones in our body. So having that good relationship, it benefits everybody. And what's really cool is that it doesn't have to just be with a mom and a baby, which is what they thought originally. It can be anyone. It can be with a dad. It can be with older kids. It can be with aunts, uncles, grandparents, teachers, coaches, doctors, anybody in your life. So it's really cool and powerful to think, you can form positive relationships with anybody at any time, and both people are going to really benefit from that physically and emotionally. So again, when you think about what's this really all about, it's about relationships. And when you don't know what to do, when you're dealing with something that's really challenging behaviorally, think about your relationship and let that be your guide. The next thing I want to teach you about is behavior principles. So it took me a year-long 3-credit course, so 6 credits total, hours and hours and hours of studying to understand this, but you guys are much smarter than me, so it's going to take you less than 30 seconds to understand. This is how behavior works. It's really easy to understand. It's really hard to do it in your everyday life, especially when you're tired and frustrated as a parent. So here we go. You reinforce what you want to see more of, and you do not reinforce what you want to go away. And that's it. That's all of behavior in a nutshell. If there's a behavior that you like that's really a positive thing, reinforce it. And we'll talk about how to do that. You want to make that behavior happen more. If a behavior is not positive and it's problematic, you do not want to reinforce it and you want to make it go away as a result. So this is, again, the basics of behavior. It's really, frustrating for me at times because I read a lot of behavior plans. I see a lot of, support plans for kids. And a lot of times when they're not going well, it's because they've lost sight of this very basic principle that, you just reinforce the good stuff and don't reinforce the bad stuff. And that's it. So here, we have Pavlov and his dogs. And the dogs have turned the tables on Pavlov. So they say, watch what we can make Pavlov do. As soon as I drool, he'll smile and write in his little book. So they've conditioned him. I love this cartoon. So how do you reinforce a good behavior? What does that mean? Well, the first way is to notice it. If you notice a behavior and you respond to it, that behavior is going to happen more and more, especially with someone who's very social, right? So people with Down syndrome, if we just notice their good behaviors, they're going to want to do it more because they like the feedback, they like the attention. This is called the Hawthorne effect, which is that if you notice something and you track it, it's going to change. This is how Weight Watchers works, right? So instead of just eating whatever you eat and hoping for the best, you write it down, you track it, you pay attention to what you're eating, and then it changes, right, for the better. So Weight Watchers is not magic, but it's really, really effective because it's using this basic principle of paying attention to something that you want to shift. If you want to take it a step further, you praise the good behavior, right? You say, wow, I love how you tied your shoes. I love how you cleaned your room. I loved how you cleaned off the whiteboard. I love how you, packed up your lunch, whatever it is, right? Get excited about that behavior. So if we want to take this a step further, we can make it a little more structured using something called the token economy. A token economy is just like aggressive social problem solving, It sounds fancy, it sounds difficult, but it's not. It's really a simple concept. You're picking a few goals, a few things that you want a child to do. You're building a structure around it, and you're providing some rewards. And the big thing with this is to keep it simple. So a lot of times, again, kids walk into my office and they have a behavior plan and it's 30 pages long. And the first thing that I do is I turn to the kiddo and I say, how's this work? Right? And so often kids have no clue how it works, right? Because it's too complicated. So number one, a complicated plan is not an effective plan. A lot of times the more complicated we make it, the harder it is for everyone to understand. The other thing that's not great about a complicated behavior plan is that people don't tend to use them, right? So even if it's a really amazing plan that's well thought out, the odds that people are sticking to it in 6 months are very, very low. So I like simple that you're actually going to use, because one thing that's really important for you to know about these plans and token economies is that it's not just for kids. It's really for us, the adults, because when kids are having behavior problems, they tend to get a lot more negative feedback from grown-ups than positive feedback. So if kids are struggling behaviorally, we get frustrated and we tend to notice every little negative thing that they do. And we tend to not notice the good stuff that they do. So you can imagine if you're the child in that situation, eventually you just say, well, what's the point of doing all the good stuff? Because no one even notices, right? I'm just going to, do the annoying stuff that gets attention, right? Because at least I get something. So these strategies are really for us, the adults, to remember we have to notice the good stuff so that we teach what's called differential reinforcement. We teach that when you do good things, the environment responds in a positive way. And when you don't do good things, that doesn't happen. So here's a token economy. We have a few jobs that we want our friend, a little girl, to do at bedtime at night in order to earn a reward. So this is a little girl I worked with who was having a really, really hard time in the evening. And all we did is I sat down with the family. We talked about a few jobs that she had at night that she had to get done. And then we chose the ones that we wanted to focus on. So bath time, pajamas, and brushing her teeth. And then I sat with her and we looked online and we picked out some icons, some photos that she liked to represent each of those tasks. So we wanted to be visual, obviously. And then we made a little chart. So, she takes a bath, she puts her pajamas on, she brushes her teeth, she gets a prize. No big deal. This is not, rocket science. This didn't take long at all. A lot of times people get hung up on the prize. Take a minute and think about what would be the best prize for many of our friends with Down syndrome. And you can write it in the chat if you would like. All right. Well, I assume some of you are out there maybe yelling in your living rooms. It's social, right? Something social. That's the biggest motivator for this group of people, is something that is engaging with another person. So a prize does not mean a toy. It doesn't mean a sticker. It doesn't mean food. The best prize is going to be something social. So maybe it's reading a book with mom or playing a game with your brother or something like that, right? It doesn't have to be a big deal. It doesn't have to cost any money, and it's not going to get old, right? Attention doesn't get old. So a lot of times kids don't really care too much about the prize. They care more about getting the attention, getting the positive feedback from the people in their life. So why does this work? This is such a simple thing. Why does it work so well? Well, if you think about how the brain works in Down syndrome, this is providing visuals, right? So instead of this, if you didn't have any, chart or token economy, what would you do at night? You'd be chasing your kid around the house saying, do this, do that, do this, do that. You'd be using a lot of language, right? That doesn't work so well. This also provides repetition, right? Every night's the same. These are the 3 jobs that you need to do tonight, right? Every day it's the same. So it's visual and it's repetitive. So it's supporting memory and processing. And we also have motivators built in, right? There's a reward, including attention for positive behaviors. And most importantly, in my opinion, this is supporting your relationship, right? Because instead of fighting and running around and yelling and getting frustrated about what you need to do, now it's just, hey, what's on the wall? Do you want your reward? Do you want to play a game with your brother? Then you got to do these jobs, right? We're not going to fight about it. It's not going to be a big issue. It's just, this is what you have to do if you want your reward. All right, just keeping an eye on the time. The next thing we'll talk about is the functions of a behavior. So when you're a stressed out parent and you're tired and you're frustrated, it feels like the function of the behavior is to make you insane, right? That's why my child is doing this, just to make me crazy. But obviously that's not true, right? Kids don't wake up in the morning and think, I want to make my mom nuts today, right? That's not, even though it feels that way. So behaviors do have a purpose. And this is called the learning trial. So it's the ABCs of behavior. There's an antecedent, what happened before, there's the behavior itself, and then there's the consequence of the behavior. So there are really cool assessments that can be done, functional behavior assessments, that can look at all of this and try and figure out what's driving a behavior, what's keeping it going, and help you learn strategies. When we do those behavior assessments, typically what we find in Down syndrome is, number one function of behaviors is escape and avoidance. So math is hard for me. I don't like this. I'm out of here. I'm going to run out of the room, right? Or I do like this. I'm having a great time at this birthday party and I don't want it to end. So I'm avoiding the end. I'm avoiding the transition. I'm going to stop and flop my body to the floor and good luck to you moving me, right? I'm sure plenty of you have seen that. The other big one is attention seeking. So for example, when I worked with kids in a big hospital, and we would have to talk to their parents with the kids present, and the kids would be bored and miserable, right? And they didn't want us to sit there and talk about their behaviors with them listening. It was not a good setup. So they would say, oh, what can I do to deal with this situation? And many, many times kids would go over and turn the lights off, right? And because I was, the young guy on the team, I always had the windowless office. So, if you turn the lights off, it was pitch black. So it was a great way to get attention, right? Similarly, we see in young kids that when they don't have the language to ask another child to play or to solve a problem, they might resort to hitting that child, right? It's a great way to get some attention if you don't have other means of doing so. So why are these the big functions? Again, if we go back to the brain, if you have lower intrinsic motivation, if you're not as driven and you're frustrated and you're tired, it makes sense that when you're provided with something that's really hard for you to do and you don't want to do it, you run, you bolt, right? That makes sense. And similarly, if you're really social and you have some trouble with impulse control, it makes sense that you might do some things that are ill-advised to get some attention. So it kind of makes sense that these would be the big behavior or the big drivers of behavior that we see. If we want to use some tools to manage this, we have a lot of things at our disposal. Some of these you may know. We're going to talk about just a few. So for example, giving kids choices, right? We can fight with kids for a half an hour about brushing their teeth, or we can start to say, you know what, I'll give you some of the choice here and use some of the control. Do you want to brush your teeth first or use the potty first? Both are acceptable, both are helpful in getting the routine done, but you're giving some control over to the child, which often leads to much more compliant behavior. Similarly, if you see behavior problems starting, you can use what's called redirection. So instead of letting that behavior play out, two kids fighting over the iPad, you say, hey, come help me set the table, right? Do something else. Don't, go down this rabbit hole of a bad behavior that's going to cause a big conflict in our home. And instead, when we redirect, I often try and do something social, right? So it's not go do something else in your room, go play with Legos. It's come be with me, come help me set the table. And similarly, we can provide motivation, right? So we can say, well, if you don't like something like homework, what's something that you do like? I worked with a kid who loved the show Cash Cab, and he would do anything for Cash Cab. So we wanted to do a little bit of homework, not much. And what did we do? We motivated him with Cash Cab. First do your homework, then you get Cash Cab, right? So pretty simple stuff that can really go a long way when we're dealing with escape and avoidance. When attention seeking is driving a behavior, we have a really easy option for intervention at first. So for example, Joshua loves going to his sister's room and jumping on the bed. And when he does that, His sister and his dad run into the room. They get really upset. Josh laughs hysterically and continues to do it until dad tosses him over his shoulder and takes him out of the room, right? So what is the function of this behavior? Okay, I can tell, I can hear you even across the country. Everyone's saying attention seeking, right? And what's keeping the behavior going? Well, he's getting the attention, right? He's getting exactly what he wants. So what could they do differently? You're right again, they could do nothing, right? This was a family I met with, and they had a few concerns, but this was one of their big ones. And they had waited months and months to talk with me. And finally they came in and I said, well, what if you did nothing? And they looked at each other and said, what is this guy talking about? We waited all this time for this, right? So we laughed about it a little bit, but I said, I think the big reactions to this are really keeping it going. So for some behaviors, really just not reacting to them, not responding so emotionally, really can limit the behavior or get rid of it altogether. Whenever I present that idea, I always get people saying, but you can't ignore everything, which is exactly correct. So to deal with that, what I like to do is to organize behaviors into different tiers. And this is based on Ross Greene's work in a book called The Explosive Child. I don't really love the title of the book, but what he talks about is baskets of behaviors. There are different levels of behavior that you respond to differently. So basket one would be a safety issue. Your kid's running into the street, go get the kid, right? You can't let that happen. That's a safety concern. Basket two is something that you may or may not deal with depending on what else you have going on, if it's a priority or not. So for example, I worked with a little boy who was only willing to eat dinner on the couch and he wouldn't eat with his family at the dinner table. However, that little boy was also chasing his sisters around the house with steak knives. So, we decided, well, let's deal with the steak knives before we deal with where he eats dinner, right? Because there were some other really high priority things. What did we do with the steak knives? We put them in a new cabinet with a really heavy duty lock, right? We don't mess around with some things like that. Sometimes we just have to say, you know what? We're going to change the environment to make this safe and okay. Basket three is something that's not really causing any harm, and just ignoring it is going to be the best thing. So this is a lot of the stimming behaviors, the repetitive things, humming, tongue clicking, the noises, that kind of stuff that can drive you really insane as a parent, but if you can step back and stay calm about it, it's not really causing any harm. And a lot of times the best way to deal with those are just ignoring. So in my opinion, a lot of this stuff is very simple. It's not hard to understand, but when you're in the moment and you're frustrated and you're tired and you're trying to get to work and you're trying to get kids to school, it can be really, really hard to follow these principles. So this is a picture of me in 2002 when I just was a drill sergeant with the kids that I worked with, and I thought that I just had to be more strict and more tough, and that would lead them to listen to me. And that, boy, was I totally wrong. That did not work at all. So it took a while, but I eventually learned. So we can also do some things in the environment to change how we structure the world to adapt for kids' needs. In order to do this, if we think about the strengths and weaknesses, it will guide us, right? So we know visual works better than verbal. We know social engagement is strong and impulse control is usually kind of weak. And we know that routine and predictability and sameness work well, whereas being inconsistent may not work so well. So we can use this on a day-to-day basis. We can keep a routine. We can make that routine visual if we want to make it even more powerful. So this is just a visual schedule, right? What do I want you to do in the morning? Again, just like in the evening, instead of chasing you around the house, yelling and saying you have to do this, get your clothes on, we're going to be late for school, right? Why don't we think ahead a little bit, put all the jobs on a piece of paper on the wall with pictures so that kids have a reminder of what they need to do. We can also use things like timers to help kids deal with, when are we leaving? When are we coming back? When am I done with homework? And social motivators and rewards like attention, or even playing with someone in the family or in time with someone in the family as a formal motivator. You don't want to clean up the living room. I understand. First clean, but you want to play with mommy. First clean up, then play with mommy, right? You pair the non-desired task with the desired task. When things get harder, we can use something even more formal and structured that's not hard, which is called a social story or a video model, where instead of talking to kids about a situation like going to a new school or going to the dentist or the doctor, we show them. We make a book with pictures and we show them what's going to happen. Or now there are really cool videos. Brian Coyne out of Chicago has a whole series of videos for people with Down syndrome, starring people with Down syndrome going through different activities, medical visits and things like that, to help show them what's going to happen. Because talking to a person with Down syndrome like we would normally do as adults is not so helpful, right? To say, well, then they're going to do this, then we're going to do that. That doesn't work so well. So if we can show them with pictures and video, it works much better. In order to make a social story, you want mostly pictures without many words. You want it to be really simple. You want it to show the sequence of events, show the desired behaviors, so what you do want to happen, and do it many, many times. Go through this a lot of times, like as a bedtime story. So, when I was at Children's, there were a lot of kids that we were sending for sleep studies, and they were having a really hard time with it. And some wonderful people in the sleep clinic made a sleep study story that we sent home for kids. And they would read through the story over and over and over in the month leading up to their sleep study. And then instead of coming in and getting really scared and anxious and not participating in the sleep study, having big tantrums, refusing to sleep, staying up all night, now they knew what to expect because they had a mental map for it. They had what we call a schema, where they knew what was going to happen. It was really, really helpful. We also know what we can avoid when we're helping people with Down syndrome. So, too much language, right? If your son is hitting, we could say, no, Jonathan, there's no hitting in his house. If you hit, you're going to be in timeout. You'll lose your iPad for the rest of your life, whatever it may be. Or we can just say no hitting, right? We also know that not keeping a routine, being inconsistent, can make kids more anxious, leads to more resistance. And we know that getting upset or showing an emotional or social response for a behavior that we don't like, that we don't want to keep happening, can really backfire, right? So getting really upset about something, even though it makes sense to be upset about it, may not make that behavior go away. It may make it happen more and more because the reaction is really reinforcing. So I'm kind of going at light speed here. I hope it's okay. Briefly want to touch on discipline. And I just want to mention, why are we not talking more about discipline? Well, the big reason for that is that positive behavior supports, the stuff we've talked about, structuring the environment differently, using structure, using visual schedules, using token economies, all of that works much better than punishing kids. Getting ahead of the behavior and understanding why it's happening and how to prevent it is much more effective in the short run and in the long run. For people with Down syndrome, this is probably even more important because if you remember, there's that social and emotional radar, right? And think about, how do you feel when you're punishing? How do you feel when you're disciplining? We're not calm and rational and in the books that people were reading 30 years ago, right? About the calm disciplinarian. No, we're upset. We're frustrated. I've given you 25 warnings. You're still hitting. Now you're in a timeout and I'm raising my voice and I'm using a strong facial expression, right? So when we do that, those messages for a kid are not what we think they are. We think the message is, oh boy, I better not do that again. Dad's really upset. But really the message that's being sent is, ooh, look at this. Look at what I can do. I have a lot of control and a lot of power over Dad. Dad totally just lost his mind when I did that. I'm going to do that again tomorrow. That was fun, right? So we can really inadvertently reinforce these things. So when we think about discipline, we have to go back to the basics of behavior, that we reinforce what we want to see more of, and we do not reinforce what we want to go away. So if we want to reinforce a behavior, we add to it. We add attention, we add feedback, we add rewards. If we want to think about discipline, we think about taking away. What can I remove from this situation? And of course, If we want to discipline effectively for people with Down syndrome, what do? We remove us, right? We remove the social dynamic. So we can take away our eye contact. We can take away language. We're not going to talk. We can keep a calm voice or a quiet voice, and we have to watch our facial expressions, because again, with that social and emotional radar, your face can really say a lot, right? So even messages that we're not intending to send can be really, really powerful. When you do have to respond to a behavior, you can respond to it without getting overly emotional. So you can remove your facial expressions, you can remove the child, you can remove others, but you can stay calm when you're doing it, right? You can go get that child that's running into the street and make sure they go back, and then come up with a plan for dealing with that behavior, but not freak out and yell and get upset, because that's going to make that behavior more fun and exciting and more likely to happen again. So again, this was kind of a light speed presentation, so I hope it was still helpful. But when we're thinking about how to help kids with their behavior, I think we really have to understand how their brain works, how they understand the world, and that will make us more effective. And if you think about what it means for someone to have Down syndrome in terms of behavior management, I think it means we have a head start. We kind of know some themes about how the brain works, and therefore some of the strategies that may work better or worse. This is just a cute kid. So in closing, if you focus on your relationship and the positive and the strengths of a child, that will help you choose the best strategies. And the goal is not perfection. The goal is improvement, right? Where no one's going to get it 100% right. And the end point is not tomorrow or next month or even next year. The end point is that that person with Down syndrome grows up and becomes an adult and doesn't have their behavior be the thing that limits them from doing what they want to do, working where they want to work, living where they want to live, having the life they want to live. We don't want behavior to be the thing that gets in the way. I would be remiss if I didn't mention the book. One thing that I think is important for the Down syndrome community to sadly become aware of is that I don't know if Jen, you are aware of this, but Woodbine House that publishes all of these books is going out of business. They're closing their business. So all of these books are soon going to be out of print, which is a real problem. So, this is the first time I've said this publicly. What I'm thinking, what I'm going to try to do is that there's not really a market to publish these kinds of things anymore. So what I'm going to try to do is that, Amazon, they own everything, right? So they have self-publishing. So you can basically, I could continue to publish the book through Amazon. So I would have to go through that process. So I'm hoping to still have it available. But it's going to be interesting that a lot of these materials are not going to be available for much longer. It's in the next couple months. So I will try and get it available again as soon as possible. And my thinking is that it would be available on Kindle for very, very cheap. And then on the print side, you have to at least pay for the printing. But I'm hoping to make it still easily accessible for people. And now we have just a few minutes for questions. And as Jen said before, I know it's hard, but if you could keep your questions kind of more thematic and general about some of the ideas, that would be great. I know it's tempting to ask questions about your individual child, but one thing that you should keep in mind is that when you ask questions that are very specific to a specific child, if you ask me that question in my office, I would ask you 50 questions in response before I gave you much advice or an answer. So just something to keep in mind, and we'll do our best as a group.
There were a couple of things that popped up that came up several times, and
sure, I'll let you guide.
One that would, I think, well, number one, I'm going to start my own publishing company just to help keep these books in print for people across the board. That's been, very sad news on the Woodbine side, but I don't know that I have that in my wheelhouse right now to start a publishing company. But one of the things that came up from several parents was what this looks like differently if your child has a dual diagnosis of autism and Down syndrome, and just, are there some generalizations that parents might consider in supporting their child?
Yes. So that is a really good question. What's tough is that the core of autism is a less interest, less motivation for socialization and relationships. So what that means is a lot of what I've said when you have a dual diagnosis of autism kind of doesn't apply because that social engagement is not such a good motivator. That said, the reason that I feel like what we're talking about is helpful to most, and that how do I say this? I'm trying to say it in the right way. But I guess what reassures me is that the techniques that are out there for autism, which are, kind of widely known, like applied behavior analysis and things like that, work really well with people with Down syndrome. So I guess what I'm saying is when you have a dual diagnosis, I think being in the autism world is very helpful because a lot of those themes and ideas are going to be very applicable and helpful. And when I started doing this work, what I found is that people with Down syndrome without autism did not have a lot of resources for behavior management. So I think, hopefully we can kind of meet the needs of both groups. But there is quite a distinction there, yes.
That's good. And people are just sharing lots of good resources. One of the questions too was, is there a good place to go to get some of the social stories? Are those available? And also the visual cues, are there some good places that you might recommend parents or schools could go to get some of those?
Yeah, so for the visual cues, there's an app called the First Then app, which is pretty good. And, you can make visual schedules and token economies on the fly. Like, so if you're a family that has an iPad or a phone, with you when you're going to the doctor's office or something, you can whip up a new visual schedule, with a reward right then on the fly, which is really cool and helpful. Yes, I see people are agreeing with me on First Then app. So that's a really helpful resource. For social stories, they're all over the place. So, a good Google search will get you a social story about pretty much anything. My preference actually is to make your own with your child as the star, so like just take your phone out, take some pictures of your child doing what they need to do. And then, sorry, I'm getting distracted by the comments. And make your own social story or video model where you have someone that maybe a sibling or a friend. Let's say it's a dentist visit. Let's make a video of that person going through the entire dentist visit. And then your child can watch that video and see exactly what it looks like at their dentist's office, right? The actual dentist. They can see the real people, the real office, and watch that experience. So as much as, it's great to have ready-made resources, which there are many, it's also nice to make your own. Someone asked where to get that sleep study book. That it's not a CPAP book. It was just the sleep study, not the CPAP. That was through Boston Children's. I don't know, right, that was years ago, so I don't know if they're sharing that or not, but you could certainly reach out to the Down syndrome clinic at Boston Children's Hospital and ask them. And I imagine there might be others out there.
That would be something too. In our really big mom group, the All-Star group, there's a lot of books and things that people have shared. I know somebody created some things in Canva not that long ago also that were just kind of that social story. And so it could be even something that you plug your own kiddo's picture into. Like Dr. Stein was suggesting, I think that a lot of us have good luck and have had really good luck with our providers also, like saying, hey, I'd love to come in and take some pictures or do a pre-visit with our child. And, they will be great about that for most all of things I've heard about that way. I want to really honor your time tonight too, Dr. Stein. Is the slide deck something that we can get a copy of? Was another question that popped.
Yeah, I can send Jen the handouts. Yep.
Okay, perfect.
Okay.
So I can get that, and that I can get uploaded pretty quickly too for everybody. The video will take a little bit longer because we're trying to transcribe it and also translate it. into Spanish. So that just will take a few more steps to get done. Again, this literally was life-changing for us. When you said the steak knives, I mean, Owen, when we moved to our new house, he thought it was hilarious to grab the knives out of the thing. And when we ended up going to NDSC, it was about that same time when we saw the book, and, just being able to respond that way and change our lives, and for our whole family to see how that impacted and changed things. So now, I mean, it was scary and not fun at the time, but for us to see how our responses really did impact the situation and how we made it better by what we were choosing to do, it's really made things easier across the board for all of us. And everybody was very on board in the family. So not that I want dangerous things to happen in your houses, but it really was very helpful just to see that process here at our house. And you can read the comments too in the section. Yeah, you are like a guru for all of us. We literally are just so grateful for the work you've put in. I hope that you've all had some great thoughts too, and just seen everything going on here with what can be available. Just all the background and research around it too is really important, I feel like, for us to understand as we're going. And oh gosh, sorry, I'm trying to present my screen too, because I should have my pretty screen up for at least 2 seconds during this DSDN presentation. But I just want everybody to remember too that we're doing these every Thursday at 7:30 p.m. Central, and that will be at least through mid-May. We have a few more sessions coming up. It was Dr. Stein tonight, and next week we will be talking with the team from NDSS, the National Down Syndrome Society, about IFSPs and IEPs and what that looks like for our kids and your educational kind of transition when you go from early intervention into the school system. But Dr. Stein, we're so grateful for you here tonight. Thank you so much for all of your time and the work that you've done for our community, because it really has made a big difference for all of us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's my pleasure.
Thank you guys so much. If anybody else has questions, I am going to go ahead and pause the recording now.